Okay, guys, we just finished up talking about Indicator 1.3, which was mainly about the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution. And now that the war is over with, the United States has got to come up with a new form of government. And of course, that government is going to be based initially on a document that was written during the American Revolution, known as the Articles of Confederation. We're gonna look at 1.4 and look at some of the problems with that document. And that document, again, is the Articles of Confederation. And before we begin, we definitely want to address some of our learning objective questions. These are the questions that you need to be able to answer at the end of this lecture, starting with what was the Articles of Confederation? How did the Articles of Confederation limit the federal government? And of course, AOC stands for Articles of Confederation, if you were wondering. Describe the consequences of the Articles of Confederation. Describe success of the Articles of Confederation. Describe the compromises reached so that the Constitution could be ratified. And the last question is describe the Federalist Papers. So these questions you want to either jot down now or you can jot them down at the end of the lesson. Please make sure that you answer these questions at the end. So let's look at the Articles once again. Remember that the Articles of Confederation was the first form of government in the states. It was initially the first constitution. It was mainly set up to protect rights that the revolution was fought over. It would firm up a league of friendship among the states. And then we realized that once this document was in place, that it had a lot of issues, a lot of problems. And we've discussed these in previous lessons. So we're going to run through these pretty quick. If you don't know them or you need to jot them down on your note sheet, you may do so at this point. But let's look at these. Number one, there was no central government and no president. The states had their own laws and they really didn't answer to the federal government, meaning that in this case, the Articles of Confederation really gave the states a lot of the power. Second thing was that the government needed money, and we've already discussed this. After the revolution was over with, the government needed money, but there was no way to raise money because the federal government could not tax. So there was no revenue being generated by the federal government because of the lack of being able to tax. The only thing that the federal government could do is ask the states or request that the states pay taxes, and most of them, of course, said, "Nah, we're good." Another weakness was there was no army, and we've discussed Shays' Rebellion, and we're going to look at that again in just a minute. But the army couldn't, without an army, you couldn't maintain peace. And then again, what would happen if any of these states were to fight each other? Then the federal government has no way to stop it. Another weakness was that the federal government couldn't make an alliance, especially without an executive branch or a president. And then the last one was there was no common currency. Some of these states had their own form of money, so you couldn't necessarily go from one state to another and use the money from that particular state. So no common currency. So what were some of the consequences of these weaknesses? And we've looked at a few of these. Number one, the national government could not repay its war debt from the American Revolution. Number two, we got Shays' Rebellion. Remember that Shays' Rebellion showed the weakness of the federal government when they didn't have an army to put down this attack. This was when farmers attacked the courthouses in Massachusetts that were going to foreclose on their farms. Number three, they couldn't regulate interstate trade. So trade, pretty much you could charge whatever you wanted to going from one state to another. You couldn't charge any. One state could charge tax, some states didn't, so on. So they couldn't regulate interstate trade at that point either. The states could tax each other. So the Articles of Confederation basically were really unable to meet the needs of the people, not being able to, the government being able to repay its debt by not being able to charge taxes, Shays' Rebellion not having an army for protection, even amongst their own people, And number three, they couldn't regulate interstate trade. States could tax each other. They could do whatever they want as far as trade went between states. So again, they're not meeting the needs of the people at this point. But for all of its problems, there were some successes of the Articles of Confederation. And the first one being that they negotiated the treaty that ended the American Revolutionary War, and that's the Treaty of Paris of 1783. They also issued the Land Ordinance of 1785, which is going to pretty much survey the land that they got after the American Revolution, the land that was west of the Appalachian Mountains leading up to the Mississippi River. So they began to survey that land and figure out what they had. And then we had the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which would start the procedure for dividing the Northwest Territory up in 2 states. And if you look on this picture here, you can see when a lot of those states, or when a lot of those pieces of territory became states. And you can see who they are: Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. The Northwest Territory would also make slavery legal. After the Revolution, remember that part of the Declaration of Independence was all men are created equal, and they were trying to live by those principles that were set up by the Revolution. And so slavery in the Northwest Territory would be made illegal. Again, this is addressing those weaknesses one more time. There's a chart on your note sheet. If you want to pause the video at this point, you can to jot these things down. Remember, no standing army. Remember that Shays' Rebellion happened. That was the problem. And what they did as far as the change in the Constitution is that they said that the government could have a standing army. There was no federal taxation. The problem was that the national government could only request taxes. They couldn't enforce them. With the Constitution, the new Constitution, to replace the Articles of Confederation, the national government was allowed to levy taxes. There was no single national currency. Remember that each state had its own type of money, but with the new Constitution, the national government created a common currency and could control interstate trade. There was no judicial branch, so there was different laws in different states, different interpretation. The national government's going to create a court system that would address laws that would be handled by the federal government. No executive leadership, no president. They couldn't negotiate with anyone. Under the Constitution, the national government has the right to form treaties. And the last one, each state had equal votes. The population of states vary. Some states have more people than others. So with the new Constitution, they decided to divide the new Congress into a 2-house system, the House of Representatives and the Senate. And that's going to come with one of the compromises, which we're going to discuss next. So in order for the Constitution to be passed, they're going to have to come up with some agreements. They're going to have to compromise. A compromise is when you agree or you settle a problem. And the first question that they had was, how will states be represented? The first plan that was presented was the Virginia plan. And basically this favored large states. And the states would get their representatives in the new legislature or in the new Congress, but it would be based on population. Of course, all of the large states were for that. Small states were not. So the small states come up with their plan, known as the New Jersey Plan. And in this plan, state representatives are equal regardless of the population. And so we have these two conflicting plans. The compromise that is going to be reached is going to be known as the Great Compromise, basically taking these two plans and applying them to a 2-house legislature or a bicameral legislature. The first house of the bicameral legislature would be done by population, which is the House of Representatives, which is what we have today. The second house would be the Senate, where there would be equal representation with each state getting 2 senators. So they're addressing both of these plans and they're reaching what they would call the Great Compromise, which we still have in place today, the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House of Representatives being based on population, and the Senate being based on everyone having equal amount of votes, each state having 2 senators. The other problem that they had was, how would they count the slaves? Of course, slaves weren't really regarded as people. They were considered to be property at this point. So how were they going to count these people? And of course, in the South, there was a huge slave population. In the North, not so much. So naturally, the South wanted to have as much representation as they could, and they wanted these slaves to be counted. The North is going to say, no, let's not count them. The South said, yes, we need them to count because they want as much power as they can have in the new Congress. The compromise that was reached is known as the Three-Fifths Compromise. And what the Three-Fifths Compromise says is that for every 5 slaves, it would count as 3 people. So slaves count as 3/5 of a person towards their total population. So again, every 5 slaves equals 3 people for population count. That was the Three-Fifths Compromise, and that was done in 1787. So ratification of the Constitution. The word ratify means to formally approve. All they needed out of the 13 states, all they needed were 9 to actually ratify the Constitution. They got those 9. The new Constitution would create what we call a federal system. You need to know what a federal system is. A federal system is where state government and federal government share power. It is also going to create, the new Constitution would also create 3 branches of government: the executive, legislative, and judicial. The executive being the office of the presidency, the legislative being the Congress, and the judicial being the Supreme Court and all of the federal courts. Out of this, there's going to become 2 groups or 2 parties that are going to form. These are going to be the first 2 political parties. The first one being the Federalist Party. These were supporters of a strong national government. If you were a Federalist, you believed in a loose interpretation of the Constitution. You believed in something known as the elastic clause, that the Constitution could be interpreted however you wanted to make it fit whatever you needed it to fit. So Federalists believed in a loose interpretation, and they believed in the elastic clause within the Constitution. If you were an anti-Federalist, you favored stronger states' rights. You believed that the national government shouldn't have a lot of power. You favored that the states should have more of the power. If you're an anti-Federalist, you also believed in a strict interpretation of the Constitution, so you could limit the power of the national government. So they believed in a strict interpretation, whereas the Federalists believed in a loose interpretation. Some papers were written. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, a couple of guys got together and they wrote a series of papers known as the Federalist Papers. The purpose of the Federalist Papers were to help people understand the intentions of the Constitution. And naturally, they were biased towards the Federalist view. James Madison and Alexander Hamilton were the main 2 writers of the Federalist Papers. The anti-Federalists, though, saw these papers as a threat and thought that if the Constitution was passed as is, the national government would have way too much power. So the 2 groups are going to have to compromise once again. A compromise is going to have to be reached between the anti-Federalists and the Federalists if this new Constitution is going to go through. The main reason why the anti-Federalists wanted to change the Constitution was to protect individuals from the government. And so they argued for a Bill of Rights to be included in on the Constitution. And that is why we have our first 10 amendments, those Bill of Rights that we all know. Of course, right to bear arms, freedom of press, freedom of speech, all of those things come from this whole event. and the idea that the Anti-Federalists thought that the Constitution should limit the power of the national government. Okay, that's going to do it for 1.4. We're going to look at 1.5 in the next lesson. Make sure that you go back and you address your learning objective questions. I will put them right back up here for you guys to look at real quick. And if you need a minute to jot those down, you can hit your pause button and you can knock those learning objectives out. And that is going to do it for 1.4. Start reviewing, getting ready, because eventually we are going to have either a test or quiz coming up in the very near future. All right, I'll catch you guys on the next one.